March 15, 1944. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of the Smithsonian Institution's storage facility in Washington, where archivist Margaret Whitmore carefully unwrapped a collection of Civil War photographs donated by the estate of Colonel Raymond Hutchinson. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she lifted each tintype from its protective sleeve, cataloging images of young soldiers frozen in time, their faces bearing the weight of a nation torn apart. But when she reached the 43rd photograph in the collection, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The image showed a Confederate private leaning casually against a cannon, his uniform crisp and unblemished, his face turned toward the camera with an expression that seemed impossibly out of place, a genuine, relaxed smile that belonged more to her own era than to the 1860s. The photograph itself appeared authentic at first glance. The tintype measured 4 inches by 6 inches, standard for the period, and showed the characteristic silvery sheen that distinguished genuine Civil War-era images from later forgeries. The soldier wore the distinctive gray wool uniform of the Confederate States Army, complete with brass buttons stamped with the letters CSA and a kepi cap tilted at a jaunty angle. His rifle rested against his shoulder in a pose that photographers of the era would have carefully staged, as exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still for up to 15 seconds. Yet something about this particular image troubled Margaret deeply. She had examined thousands of Civil War photographs during her 12 years at the Smithsonian, and she had never encountered a subject who looked so thoroughly comfortable, so utterly modern in their demeanor. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass, a heavy brass instrument that had belonged to her predecessor, and began examining the photograph more closely. The soldier's face came into sharper focus, revealing details that made her pulse quicken. His teeth, visible through his broad smile, appeared remarkably white and straight, an anomaly in an age when dental care was primitive at best, and most soldiers suffered from poor nutrition and inadequate hygiene. The skin on his face showed none of the weathering, scarring, or signs of disease that typically marked men who had spent months or years in military encampments. His hair, visible beneath his cap, had been cut with a precision that seemed almost surgical, lacking the uneven, scissors-cut appearance common to 19th-century barbering. But what truly captured Margaret's attention was something she noticed in the soldier's eyes. Unlike other Civil War subjects, whose gazes often appeared distant or haunted, this young man looked directly at the camera with an expression of amusement, as if he were enjoying a private joke. There was a knowingness in those eyes, a self-awareness that seemed entirely foreign to the photographic portraits of that era. Margaret set down her magnifying glass and reached for her notes, her handwriting shaky as she recorded her initial observations. She knew she needed to consult with others, to have this photograph examined by experts who specialized in authenticating historical images. The next morning, Margaret contacted Dr. Edmund Pierce, the foremost authority on Civil War photography in the United States. Dr. Pierce had spent 40 years studying the works of Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and other prominent photographers of the 1860s, and he had exposed numerous forgeries attempting to capitalize on the public's fascination with America's bloodiest conflict. When Margaret described the photograph over the telephone, Dr. Pierce's initial response was dismissive. He had encountered countless fraudulent images over the decades, most of them crude attempts to create sensational discoveries that would attract media attention and inflate the value of otherwise ordinary collections. However, Margaret's reputation as a meticulous and conservative researcher convinced Dr. Pierce to make the journey from his home in Philadelphia to examine the photograph in person. He arrived at the Smithsonian on March 20th, 1944, carrying a leather case filled with specialized equipment, high-powered loops, chemical testing supplies, and reference materials documenting the specific characteristics of authentic Civil War-era photography. Dr. Pierce's weathered hands, spotted with age and chemical stains from decades of darkroom work, reached for the photograph with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. For nearly 3 hours, Dr. Pierce examined the image under various lighting conditions and magnifications, occasionally muttering to himself in a mixture of fascination and disbelief. He tested the edges of the tintype with chemical solutions designed to determine the approximate age of the metal plate. scraped microscopic samples from the photographic emulsion for later analysis, and compared the image's composition and tonal qualities to verified examples from the Civil War period. When he finally looked up from his work, his expression had transformed from skepticism to profound puzzlement. The photograph, by every measurable standard, appeared to be authentic, created using techniques and materials that were only available during the early 1860s, before the widespread adoption of more modern photographic processes. Yet the subject himself remained an impossible paradox, a figure who seemed to exist outside the constraints of his own time. Dr. Pierce's laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania became the photograph's home for the next 6 weeks, as he assembled a team of specialists to conduct the most thorough analysis ever attempted on a single Civil War image. The team included chemists who specialized in 19th-century photographic processes, historians who had cataloged every known Confederate uniform variation, and even a dentist who examined the soldiers' teeth through high-magnification photography. Each expert approached the task with the assumption that they would quickly identify the fraud, expose the clever forgery, and return to their regular work with an amusing anecdote about the gullibility of collectors. Instead, every test confirmed what Dr. Pierce had reluctantly concluded during his initial examination. The photograph itself was genuine. The tintype dated to approximately 1862 or 1863, based on the composition of the metal plate and the specific chemistry of the collodion wet plate process used to create the image. The uniform matched Confederate Army regulations from that period precisely, down to the type of thread used in the stitching and the specific brass alloy used for the buttons. Even the cannon visible in the background was identified as a 12-pound Napoleon, one of the most common artillery pieces used by both Union and Confederate forces during the war. According to historical records maintained at the National Archives, the photograph had been part of a collection assembled by Colonel Raymond Hutchinson, a Union cavalry officer who had collected Confederate artifacts throughout his military service. Hutchinson's papers, donated to the Smithsonian along with the photographs, included a journal entry from October 7, 1863, describing his acquisition of a most curious photographic portrait of a rebel soldier, taken from a Confederate camp near Chattanooga following the battle. Hutchinson noted that he had been struck by the soldier's unusual expression and had preserved the photograph as a curiosity, though he provided no additional information about the subject's identity. The research team's investigation led them to examine similar photographs from the same period, searching for any other examples of Confederate soldiers displaying such anomalous characteristics. Dr. Pierce personally reviewed more than 3,000 Civil War photographs housed in museums and private collections across the eastern United States, looking for comparable images that might provide context or explanation. He found dozens of photographs showing Confederate soldiers in various poses and settings, but none that exhibited the same modern sensibility, the same inexplicable comfort with being photographed, that characterized the mysterious soldier from Margaret Whitmore's discovery. As referenced in the April 1944 edition of the Journal of American Historical Photography, Dr. Pierce published a preliminary report detailing his team's findings and openly admitting his inability to explain the photograph's contradictions. The article attracted immediate attention from newspapers across the country, with headlines proclaiming, "Ghost Soldier from the Past Baffles Scientists," and "Time-Traveling Confederate Puzzles Historians." The publicity brought dozens of amateur investigators and conspiracy theorists to Dr. Pierce's laboratory, each claiming to have solved the mystery with increasingly implausible theories involving secret photographic techniques, elaborate hoaxes orchestrated by Union intelligence officers, or even supernatural explanations involving spirits and time anomalies. Dr. Pierce maintained his scientific skepticism throughout the media circus, but he could not deny the growing sense that this photograph represented something genuinely extraordinary. The soldier's identity remained unknown. No matching face appeared in any Confederate military records, and no unit roster listed a soldier whose description corresponded to the young man in the photograph. It was as if he had materialized solely for the purpose of having his portrait taken, then vanished back into the shadows of history without leaving any other trace of his existence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Professor Helena Crane, a linguist specializing in 19th-century American dialects at Columbia University, contacted Dr. Pierce after reading his article with an observation that had been overlooked by the purely visual analysis. Professor Crane had noticed that the photograph included a small detail visible in the background, a handwritten sign leaning against a tent that read, "Quartermaster's Supply, 3rd Georgia Volunteers." The handwriting on the sign, Professor Crane argued, provided crucial evidence about the photograph's authenticity because 19th-century penmanship had distinctive characteristics that varied by region, education level, and time period. Professor Crane spent 2 weeks analyzing the handwriting through high-resolution enlargements of the photograph, comparing the letter formations, spacing, and overall style to verified examples of Confederate Army documentation from various Georgia regiments. Her conclusion supported the photograph's authenticity. The handwriting was consistent with the work of a moderately educated soldier from the Georgia-Piedmont region, written with the type of iron gall ink commonly used in military camps during the early 1860s. More importantly, Professor Crane identified subtle spelling variations and grammatical constructions in the sign's text that reflected specific linguistic patterns of that time and place, details that would have been nearly impossible for a modern forger to replicate without extensive specialized knowledge. Yet even as the evidence mounted in favor of the photograph's authenticity, the central mystery deepened. Who was this soldier whose appearance seemed so thoroughly out of place in his own time? Why did he smile with such confidence and ease when his contemporaries typically approached photography with solemn formality? And most puzzling of all, why had no other record of his existence survived? The investigation into the mysterious soldier's identity became a full-scale historical detective story when Dr. Pierce received a letter in late May 1944 from Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an elderly woman living in Atlanta, who claimed to recognize the soldier in the photograph. Mrs. Pritchard, then 87 years old, explained that her late husband's grandfather had served with the 3rd Georgia Volunteers and had kept a collection of letters and personal items from his time in the Confederate Army. Among these items was a reference to a soldier named James Everett, described in a letter dated November 9, 1863, as a peculiar fellow who smiles too much and speaks of things no soldier should know. Dr. Pierce traveled to Atlanta on June 2, 1944, to examine Mrs. Pritchard's collection. The elderly woman welcomed him into her home, a stately Victorian residence on Peachtree Street that had survived Sherman's march through Georgia, and led him to a cedar chest containing her husband's family documents. The letters, written on fragile paper that crumbled slightly at the edges, had been carefully preserved in cotton sleeves. Dr. Pierce's hand shook as he unfolded the letter from Private Thomas Pritchard to his wife, dated November 9, 1863, written from a Confederate encampment near Missionary Ridge outside Chattanooga. Private Pritchard's letter described daily life in the camp with the mundane details that characterized most soldiers' correspondence: complaints about food rations, descriptions of weather conditions, and expressions of longing for home. But in the letter's final paragraph, Pritchard mentioned a new arrival to the company, a soldier who had been transferred from another regiment under circumstances that Pritchard found suspicious. "There is a man here named James Everett," Pritchard wrote, "who speaks with strange certainty about the war's outcome and the world beyond our conflict. He claims to know that we shall lose this war, that slavery will end, and that machines will one day allow men to speak across vast distances. The other soldiers think him mad or possessed, but I find him merely unsettling. He photographs well, the captain says, better than any soldier should." Dr. Pierce felt a chill run down his spine as he read these words. The description matched the demeanor of the soldier in the photograph perfectly, someone who possessed knowledge beyond his time, who understood the war's trajectory before it unfolded, who approached photography with a comfort that seemed anachronistic. Dr. Pierce carefully photographed the letter with his own camera, ensuring he had a complete record of this crucial evidence, then asked Mrs. Pritchard if she possessed any other documents mentioning James Everett. Mrs. Pritchard produced 2 additional letters, both written by Private Thomas Pritchard in late November of 1863. The first letter, dated November 23rd, described a battle near Missionary Ridge in which the 3rd Georgia Volunteers had suffered heavy casualties. Private Pritchard wrote with the traumatized brevity of a man who had witnessed horrors beyond description, but he made one curious mention of James Everett. Private Everett survived the fight without a scratch, as if he knew precisely where the Union shells would fall. He moves through danger as a man moves through a familiar room in darkness, guided by knowledge of obstacles unseen by others. The second letter, dated November 29th, was even more disturbing. Private Pritchard wrote that James Everett had disappeared from the camp 3 days after the battle, abandoning his post without leave or explanation. The captain sent a search party, but they found no trace of him. It is as if he simply ceased to exist. Some men say he was a spirit, others that he was a spy for the Union. I know only that he was unlike any soldier I have known, and I am relieved that he is gone. There was something wrong about him, something that made me feel as though I were looking at a man who did not truly belong to our time. Dr. Pierce obtained permission to take the letters back to Philadelphia for further analysis, promising Mrs. Pritchard that they would be preserved and eventually returned to her family. On the train journey north, he reread the letters dozens of times, trying to reconcile their content with any rational explanation. The simplest interpretation was that Private Thomas Pritchard had encountered a mentally disturbed soldier whose delusions had created an impression of prescience and supernatural knowledge. Confederate Army records were notoriously incomplete, and thousands of soldiers had deserted or disappeared during the war's chaotic final years. Perhaps James Everett had been nothing more than an unstable man who coincidentally possessed an unusual comfort with being photographed. Yet this explanation satisfied neither Dr. Pierce's scholarly rigor nor his growing intuition that something genuinely extraordinary had occurred. The photograph remained authentic by every measurable standard, and now it was linked to written testimony from a period source describing a soldier who seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. Dr. Pierce began searching Confederate military records for any mention of a James Everett who had served with Georgia regiments during 1863. But the records were frustratingly sparse. The 3rd Georgia Volunteers had lost most of its documentation when their camp was overrun during the Chattanooga campaign, and subsequent efforts to reconstruct unit rosters had relied on survivor testimony and fragmented paperwork. After weeks of fruitless searching, Dr. Pierce discovered a single reference to a James Everett in a Confederate Army requisition form dated October 15, 1863. The form, preserved in the National Archives, listed supplies distributed to soldiers in the 3rd Georgia Volunteers, and James Everett's name appeared near the bottom of a column recording the issuance of uniform items. The handwriting was different from the form's main text, as if Everett's name had been added later as an afterthought, and there were no other records, no enlistment papers, no medical records, no muster rolls, documenting his presence in the Confederate Army. It was as if James Everett had materialized in October of 1863, existed for approximately 6 weeks, had his photograph taken, and then vanished without leaving any substantial evidence of his existence beyond a handful of written references and a single impossible image. Summer gave way to autumn in 1944, and Dr. Pierce found himself increasingly isolated within the academic community as his investigation into the mysterious photograph continued. Colleagues who had initially expressed curiosity about the case now regarded him with a mixture of pity and concern, worried that his obsession with solving an unsolvable puzzle was damaging his reputation and distracting him from more legitimate scholarly pursuits. Several universities that had previously invited him to speak withdrew their invitations, and the Journal of American Historical Photography declined to publish his follow-up research, citing concerns about speculative content unsuitable for academic discourse. But Dr. Pierce could not abandon the investigation, not when every new piece of evidence seemed to deepen rather than resolve the mystery. He had spent his entire career studying the visual documentation of America's most traumatic conflict, training himself to read photographs as historical texts that revealed truths about the people and events they depicted. This photograph, with its impossible soldier and his knowing smile, challenged everything Dr. Pierce understood about the fixed nature of the past and the reliable testimony of photographic evidence. On October 3, 1944, Dr. Pierce received an unexpected visit from Dr. Robert Millikan. a physicist at the California Institute of Technology, who had won the Nobel Prize in 1923 for his work on the elementary charge of electricity. Dr. Millikan had read about the mysterious photograph in a magazine article and had traveled across the country specifically to discuss it with Dr. Pierce, bringing with him a theoretical framework that might explain the impossible image. Dr. Millikan explained that physicists had been developing increasingly sophisticated theories about the nature of time, building on Albert Einstein's revolutionary work on relativity. These theories suggested that time was not the simple, linear progression that human experience suggested, but rather a dimension that could potentially be manipulated under extreme conditions. Dr. Millikan cautioned that these ideas remained highly speculative and had no experimental verification, but he argued that if time travel were theoretically possible, a photograph of a time traveler would exhibit exactly the kinds of anomalies that characterized the image of James Everett. Dr. Pierce listened with growing excitement as Dr. Millikan outlined his hypothesis. A person from the future, Dr. Millikan suggested, would inevitably bring with them knowledge, mannerisms, and attitudes that reflected their original time period. Even if such a person attempted to blend into the past, subtle details would betray their anachronistic origins: modern dental work, contemporary grooming standards, and unconscious comfort with technology that hadn't yet been invented. Most tellingly, a time traveler would possess knowledge of future events, exactly as Private Thomas Pritchard had described James Everett's disturbing predictions about the war's outcome and technological developments that lay decades in the future. The theory was, by any conventional standard, absurd. No scientific evidence supported the possibility of time travel, and the idea that a person from the future had traveled back to the 1860s to have their photograph taken during the Civil War strained credibility beyond any reasonable limit. Yet Dr. Pierce found himself unable to dismiss the hypothesis entirely, because it was the only explanation that accounted for all the photograph's contradictions without requiring him to believe that the image was a forgery, despite overwhelming evidence of its authenticity. Dr. Millikan suggested a new approach to investigating the photograph, examining it not for evidence of fraud, but for evidence of future technology. If James Everett had been a time traveler, he might have carried items or worn clothing that incorporated materials or manufacturing techniques not available in the 1860s. Dr. Pierce agreed to this approach and spent the following weeks conducting an even more detailed analysis of the photograph, this time searching for any detail, no matter how small, that might reveal anachronistic elements. The breakthrough came on October 27, 1944, when Dr. Pierce examined the photograph under ultraviolet light as part of a standard conservation assessment. Under normal lighting, the photograph appeared entirely consistent with other Civil War-era tintypes, but under ultraviolet illumination, something extraordinary became visible. The soldier's uniform, which appeared to be made of standard Confederate Army wool, under visible light, showed a subtle fluorescent pattern under ultraviolet light that was inconsistent with natural wool fibers. Dr. Pierce immediately recognized this as potentially significant. Synthetic fibers and chemical treatments that produced fluorescence under ultraviolet light were modern developments, unavailable during the 1860s. Dr. Pierce contacted textile historians at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, specialists in historical fabrics and clothing construction. They examined high-resolution photographs of the ultraviolet fluorescence pattern and confirmed that it was unlike anything they had seen in authentic Civil War uniforms. The pattern suggested that the uniform's fabric had been treated with a modern sizing agent, or contained synthetic fibers blended with natural wool, technologies that would not be developed until the early 20th century at the earliest. This discovery transformed the investigation's entire direction. If the uniform contained anachronistic materials, then James Everett must have brought it with him from another time period. Or, more precisely, the uniform was a replica created using modern materials designed to mimic the appearance of a Confederate Army uniform. This suggested a level of sophistication in James Everett's time travel that went beyond simply appearing in the past. He had attempted to prepare for his journey by acquiring period-appropriate clothing, but the limitations of available materials had betrayed his origins. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Millikan spent hours discussing the implications of this discovery developing increasingly elaborate theories about who James Everett might have been and why he had traveled to the 1860s. The most logical explanation, they concluded, was that James Everett had been a researcher or historian from the future, someone who had used time travel technology to visit the Civil War era for documentary or scholarly purposes. The photograph might have been taken as a souvenir or proof of his journey, a memento of his expedition into the past, but this explanation raised even more troubling questions. If time travel was possible, why had there been only one documented instance of its use? Where were the other time travelers, the other photographs showing people who didn't quite belong to their era? And most disturbing of all, what had happened to James Everett after he disappeared from the Confederate camp in late November of 1863? Winter arrived early in Philadelphia during 1944, and Dr. Pierce worked through Christmas and into the new year, driven by an obsession that had consumed his life completely. His wife, Margaret, had grown increasingly concerned about his health and mental state, watching as he spent 18-hour days in his laboratory, examining and re-examining the photograph, searching for additional clues that might unlock its secrets. She had seen her husband passionate about his work before, but this investigation had transformed him into someone she barely recognized, withdrawn, consumed by theories that sounded increasingly unhinged, convinced that he was on the verge of a discovery that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of time and reality. On January 17, 1945, Dr. Pierce made a discovery that validated his obsession and terrified him in equal measure. He had been examining the photograph's metal backing under high magnification, a routine conservation check he had performed dozens of times before, when he noticed something he had previously overlooked: a series of tiny scratches on the metal surface that formed a pattern too regular to be random damage. Using a microscope with 40 power magnification, Dr. Pierce could see that the scratches formed letters and numbers, a message deliberately etched into the back of the tintype in script so small that it would have been invisible to the naked eye. The message, when Dr. Pierce finally deciphered it using a combination of magnification and photographic enhancement, read, "To whom it may concern in the year 1944 or beyond, I am Lieutenant James Everett of the United States Historical Documentation Service, Temporal Research Division, operating from base year 2028. This photograph serves as verification of successful temporal displacement and subject integration into Confederate Army Unit, 3rd Georgia Volunteers, October through November 1863. Mission parameters required documentation of soldier experience during Chattanooga campaign. Subject extraction scheduled for November 30th, 1863. If this message is discovered before that date, do not attempt to locate or contact me. Temporal contamination protocols prohibit direct interaction between period civilians and temporal research personnel." Dr. Pierce read the message 3 times before his hands began shaking so violently that he had to set down the photograph. The message was impossible. A confession of time travel etched onto the back of an authentic Civil War-era tintype, written by someone claiming to be from the year 2028. Every instinct trained by 40 years of scholarly rigor told Dr. Pierce that this must be an elaborate hoax, a forgery created by someone with access to modern technology and a perverse desire to mislead historical researchers. Yet the message had been etched into the metal backing beneath the photographic emulsion, meaning it would have been created before or during the photograph's exposure, not added later as a modern falsification. Dr. Pierce immediately contacted Dr. Millikan, who arrived in Philadelphia 2 days later to examine the discovery. The physicist brought with him specialized equipment for analyzing the depth and oxidation patterns of the etched message, tests that could potentially determine when the scratches had been made. The analysis took 3 days and produced results that defied rational explanation. The scratches showed the same level of oxidation and corrosion as the rest of the tintype's metal backing, consistent with aging that had occurred over approximately 80 years. The message, by every measurable standard, was as old as the photograph itself. Dr. Millikan sat in silence for nearly an hour after reviewing the test results, his face pale and his hands clasped tightly together. Finally, he spoke the words that both men had been thinking, but neither had dared to voice. "This suggests that time travel is not only possible, but that it will be achieved within the next 84 years. More than that, it suggests that by the year 2028, time travel will be so well developed that governments will operate formal research divisions dedicated to studying the past. The implications were staggering. If James Everett's message was genuine, then the future held technological developments beyond anything currently imaginable, advances that would make the manipulation of time itself possible. But the message also raised disturbing questions about the nature of history and free will. If researchers from the future could travel into the past, did that mean the past was fixed and unchangeable? Or could their actions alter the course of history? And if governments in the future operated temporal research divisions, what other missions had been conducted in other time periods, documented by other photographs or artifacts that historians had simply failed to recognize as anachronistic? Dr. Pierce and Dr. Millikan debated whether to make their discovery public. The message's existence would revolutionize physics, history, and philosophy, proving that time travel was not merely theoretical, but would be actually achieved within a century. Yet they also recognized the potential dangers of revealing this information. If governments or military organizations learned that time travel would be possible in the future, they might accelerate research in that direction, potentially creating temporal paradoxes or destabilizing the timeline in unpredictable ways. The message itself warned against temporal contamination, suggesting that contact between people from different time periods could have serious consequences. Ultimately, Dr. Pierce and Dr. Millikan decided to document their discovery, but keep it confidential, sharing the information only with a small circle of trusted colleagues who could continue investigating the photograph after their deaths. Dr. Pierce prepared a detailed report describing every aspect of the investigation, including high-resolution photographs of the message etched into the tintype's backing, and sealed it in a vault at the Smithsonian Institution with instructions that it should not be opened until January 1, 1975. 30 years in the future, when enough time would have passed that the information could be revealed without risking immediate exploitation. The photograph of James Everett was returned to its protective sleeve and placed in climate-controlled storage, labeled simply as Unidentified Confederate Soldier, circa 1863. The official catalog made no mention of the image's extraordinary characteristics or the message hidden on its backing. To casual researchers, it would appear to be just another anonymous Civil War portrait, one of thousands documenting young men who had fought and died in America's bloodiest conflict. But Dr. Pierce could not forget what he had discovered, could not escape the knowledge that he had held in his hands proof of humanity's future achievements, and confirmation that time itself was more malleable than anyone had imagined. Years passed, and the photograph remained in storage, its secrets known only to the small group of researchers who had been briefed on Dr. Pierce's discovery. Dr. Pierce himself died in 1953 at the age of 72, taking with him decades of additional observations and theories about James Everett and the implications of time travel. Dr. Millikan had passed away 3 years earlier, in 1953, and with his death, the number of people aware of the photograph's true significance dwindled to just 4 individuals, all of them aging academics who had been sworn to secrecy and forbidden from publishing their knowledge. Margaret Whitmore, the Smithsonian archivist who had first discovered the photograph, became its unofficial guardian during these years. She monitored the sealed report that Dr. Pierce had prepared, counting down the years until 1975 when the information could finally be revealed to the wider world. Margaret had retired from her position at the Smithsonian in 1958, but she maintained close contact with the institution, visiting regularly to ensure that the photograph remained properly preserved and that Dr. Pierce's report remained secure in its vault. In 1968, Margaret received a visitor who would change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen, a young physicist from Stanford University, had been researching theoretical frameworks for time travel as part of her doctoral dissertation when she stumbled across a brief reference to Dr. Pierce's investigation in an old journal article from 1944. The article, which predated Dr. Pierce's discovery of the message on the tintype's backing, mentioned only that an anomalous Civil War photograph had been found and was undergoing analysis. Dr. Chen, intrigued by the vague description, had spent months tracking down additional information and had eventually contacted Margaret Whitmore, Margaret initially refused to discuss the photograph, citing the confidentiality agreement she had signed 24 years earlier. But Dr. Chen was persistent, arguing that her theoretical work might provide crucial context for understanding whatever Dr. Pierce had discovered. She explained that recent advances in physics had made time travel seem less impossible than it had appeared in the 1940s. Theoretical models developed by physicists studying general relativity suggested that under specific conditions, involving exotic matter with negative energy density or rotating black holes, space-time could potentially be manipulated to allow travel into the past. Margaret listened carefully to Dr. Chen's explanations, recognizing the passion and intellectual rigor that reminded her of Dr. Pierce in his prime. After considerable deliberation, Margaret made a decision that would violate the confidentiality agreement, but might advance humanity's understanding of time itself. She invited Dr. Chen to her home and, swearing her to absolute secrecy, described Dr. Pierce's complete investigation, including the message etched on the tintype's backing. She explained that the sealed report would not be opened until 1975, but given Dr. Chen's expertise and the advancement of theoretical physics since the 1940s, perhaps the time had come to begin preparing for the information's eventual release. Dr. Chen listened in stunned silence as Margaret described James Everett's message, the claim that he had traveled from the year 2028 as part of a governmental temporal research division, and the warning against temporal contamination. When Margaret finished her account, Dr. Chen sat motionless for several minutes, processing implications that seemed to validate her theoretical work, while simultaneously raising questions that current physics could not answer. Finally, she asked the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. If time travel will be achieved by 2028, and if governments will operate research divisions studying the past, then our present moment is part of someone's history. Are we being watched right now by researchers from the future? The question articulated a fear that Margaret had harbored since first learning of the message's contents. If James Everett had traveled to the 1860s as part of a formal research mission, then presumably other researchers had traveled to other periods, including potentially the mid-20th century. Every person Margaret encountered could theoretically be a time traveler from the future, observing and documenting events while carefully maintaining the appearance of belonging to the present day. The thought was deeply unsettling, transforming everyday interactions into potential encounters with people who possessed knowledge of futures yet to unfold. Dr. Chen proposed a radical course of action. Rather than waiting until 1975 to open Dr. Pierce's sealed report, they should immediately begin searching for other evidence of time travelers in historical records. If James Everett's photograph represented just one documented instance of temporal research, then there must be other photographs, other artifacts, other written accounts describing people who seemed anachronistic or possessed impossible knowledge. By identifying patterns across different time periods, they might be able to understand the scope and nature of temporal research being conducted by future organizations. Margaret agreed to Dr. Chen's proposal, and together they began a systematic investigation that would consume the next 7 years. They examined thousands of historical photographs looking for subjects who displayed the same modern sensibility that characterized James Everett's image. They reviewed archives of letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts, searching for descriptions of people who seemed out of place in their own time. They contacted historians, archivists, and collectors around the world, asking carefully worded questions about unusual historical artifacts or unexplained anachronisms. The investigation yielded dozens of intriguing cases, photographs showing people whose appearance or demeanor seemed inconsistent with their supposed time period, written accounts describing strangers who possessed inexplicable knowledge, artifacts that incorporated materials or technologies that shouldn't have existed when they were supposedly created. But none of these cases provided the definitive proof that James Everett's photograph offered. Without messages etched into artifacts or explicit confessions of time travel, the other cases remained ambiguous, potentially explainable through conventional means, even if they seemed suspicious. In 1973, 2 years before the scheduled opening of Dr. Pierce's sealed report, Margaret and Dr. Chen made a discovery that would prove the most disturbing finding of their entire investigation. While examining records at the National Archives, They found a document that had been classified by the United States military in 1946 and only recently declassified under Freedom of Information laws. The document was a memorandum from the War Department's Intelligence Division describing an investigation into temporally displaced persons who had been encountered during World War II. According to the memorandum, American intelligence officers had identified at least 5 individuals during the war who claimed to be from the future and possessed knowledge that proved their claims were genuine. The declassified memorandum, stamped with security classifications that had only recently been lifted, detailed incidents that had been carefully suppressed by military intelligence during and after World War II. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as she photographed each page, conscious that she was documenting evidence of something far larger than a single mysterious Civil War photograph. The memorandum described 5 separate cases of individuals who had been detained by American forces between 1942 and 1945, all claiming to be temporal researchers from various future time periods. The first case involved a woman named Catherine Morrison, detained in London during 1942, after she was found photographing military installations with equipment that officers described as impossibly sophisticated for the period. Under interrogation, Morrison had initially claimed to be a British civilian, but when confronted with inconsistencies in her story, she had admitted to being a researcher from the year 2063, studying the Allied bombing campaign for a historical documentation project. Morrison had provided specific predictions about the war's progression, including accurate dates for major battles and the eventual development of atomic weapons, information that had been verified as the war continued. The memorandum noted that Morrison had been held in military custody until August 1945, when she had escaped under circumstances that remain unexplained, leaving no physical trace of her departure. The second case was even more striking. In 1943, American forces liberating Sicily had captured a German officer whose uniform and identification papers appeared authentic, but whose knowledge of 20th century history seemed impossibly comprehensive. Captain Friedrich Braun had initially been treated as a standard prisoner of war, but during routine interrogation, he had demonstrated knowledge of military technologies that would not be developed for decades, including jet propulsion systems and guided missile designs far more advanced than anything existing in 1943. When confronted, Braun had revealed that he was not actually a German officer, but a temporal researcher from the year 2047, embedded in the Wehrmacht to study German military strategy during the Mediterranean campaign. He had explained that temporal research protocols required him to integrate fully into the target time period, including accepting military assignments and participating in combat operations when necessary. The memorandum described how American intelligence officers had initially dismissed Braun's claims as the delusions of a mentally unstable prisoner, but his continued accurate predictions about technological developments and future historical events had eventually convinced them that he was telling the truth. Braun had been transferred to a secure facility in Virginia, where scientists had attempted to extract information about future technology. But Braun had refused to cooperate, citing temporal contamination protocols that prohibited sharing advanced knowledge with people from past time periods. In March 1944, Braun had died under mysterious circumstances. The memorandum stated only that he had ceased to exist during the night of March 7th, leaving behind only his clothing and personal effects, as if his physical body had been recalled to his origin point. The remaining 3 cases followed similar patterns. A Canadian nurse working in a field hospital in France had been identified as a temporal researcher from 2071, after she had used medical techniques decades ahead of their time to save wounded soldiers. A Japanese-American civilian working at a relocation camp in California had been exposed as a future historian studying the internment of Japanese Americans when he had been found with written notes describing events that had not yet occurred. An American sailor aboard a destroyer in the Pacific had been revealed as a temporal researcher after he had accurately predicted the movement of Japanese naval forces with impossible precision. In every case, the temporal researchers had been detained, interrogated, and held in military custody. And in every case, they had eventually disappeared, either escaping under unexplained circumstances or simply ceasing to exist. as if they had been recalled to their origin time periods by some mechanism that left no physical trace. The memorandum concluded with a recommendation that military intelligence establish a permanent division to monitor for and investigate potential temporal researchers. But there was no indication whether this recommendation had been implemented. Dr. Chen looked up from the documents, her face pale. "This changes everything," she said quietly. James Everett wasn't an isolated incident. Time travel isn't just theoretically possible in the future. It's apparently common enough that multiple researchers were operating during World War II alone. There must be temporal researchers in every significant historical period, documenting events firsthand while trying to remain undetected. Margaret nodded slowly, processing the implications. The photograph of James Everett, which had seemed like an impossible anomaly in 1944, now appeared to be just one visible instance of a much larger phenomenon. Temporal research was apparently a systematic, organized activity in the future, conducted by multiple individuals from various time periods spanning from the early 21st century through at least the year 2071. This suggested that time travel technology would not only be developed but would continue to be refined and improved across multiple decades, becoming sophisticated enough to allow precise targeting of specific time periods and locations. But the memorandum also revealed something deeply troubling. The temporal researchers described in the document had all been detained and interrogated by military authorities, their knowledge treated as a potential strategic asset that could be exploited for military advantage. If governments in the 1940s had responded to time travelers by imprisoning them and attempting to extract future technology, what would happen when Dr. Pierce's sealed report was opened in 1975 and the photograph of James Everett became public knowledge? Would military and intelligence agencies launch a systematic search for temporal researchers, disrupting whatever research missions were being conducted and potentially creating the very temporal contamination that the researchers' protocols were designed to prevent? Dr. Chen spent the next several weeks analyzing the patterns revealed in the declassified memorandum, trying to understand the rules and limitations that governed temporal research. Several consistent elements emerged from the 5 documented cases. First, temporal researchers appeared to arrive in the past fully integrated into the time period, with authentic documentation, appropriate clothing, and cover identities that allowed them to operate without detection. This suggested that future organizations had developed sophisticated preparation protocols for temporal missions, including the creation of period-appropriate materials and extensive training in historical customs and language patterns. Second, temporal researchers consistently refused to share advanced knowledge or technology with people from the past, citing contamination protocols that appeared to be strictly enforced. This suggested that future societies understood the dangers of altering the timeline and had established formal rules governing interactions between temporal researchers and historical populations. The researchers' willingness to accept detention and interrogation rather than reveal future technology indicated that these protocols were taken extremely seriously. Third, and most mysteriously, temporal researchers who were detained appeared to possess some mechanism for returning to their origin time period, even when held in secure facilities. The memorandum's descriptions of researchers who ceased to exist or left no physical trace suggested that temporal displacement worked both directions. People could travel into the past, but they could also be recalled or extracted back to the future, apparently without needing any physical device or equipment at the extraction point. This last observation led Dr. Chen to develop a theoretical framework for how temporal displacement might function. She hypothesized that time travel did not involve physical transportation through space, but rather the manipulation of an individual's position within space-time itself. A temporal researcher would not travel from the future to the past in any conventional sense, but would instead have their consciousness or quantum state shifted to an earlier point in the timeline while their physical form was somehow reconstructed using matter available at the destination point. This would explain why detained researchers could disappear without leaving traces. Their extraction would involve deconstructing their physical form and shifting their consciousness back to the origin point, where a new physical body could be reconstructed. The theory was wildly speculative, based on extensions of quantum mechanics and general relativity, that went far beyond anything that could be tested with 1970s technology. But it was consistent with the observed behavior of temporal researchers and suggested that time travel, when finally achieved, would be fundamentally different from the science fiction portrayals that imagined physical machines transporting people through time. Instead, time travel would involve manipulating the fabric of reality itself, editing an individual's position within the universe's timeline as one might edit text in a document. In January 1975, as the date approached for opening Dr. Pierce's sealed report, Margaret and Dr. Chen faced a difficult decision. The report would reveal the photograph of James Everett and the message etched on its backing, providing public proof that time travel would be achieved by the year 2028. But given what they had learned about military responses to temporal researchers during World War II, publicizing this information might trigger a government crackdown that would interfere with future temporal research missions and potentially alter the timeline in unpredictable ways. After extensive deliberation, they decided to delay the report's opening and instead approach the situation more carefully. Dr. Chen would use her connections in the physics community to quietly share information about temporal research with trusted colleagues, building a network of scientists who could study the phenomenon without alerting military or government authorities. Margaret would maintain custody of the photograph and related materials, ensuring they remained preserved, but not publicly accessible. They would wait and watch, looking for signs of temporal researchers in their own time period, trying to understand the scope and nature of the temporal research being conducted in the 20th century. But their careful plans were disrupted by an unexpected visitor. On March 12, 1975, Dr. Chen was working in her laboratory at Stanford when her secretary announced that someone was there to see her without an appointment. The visitor, a man in his mid-30s wearing contemporary clothing and carrying a leather briefcase, introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb from the Institute for Advanced Historical Studies. He explained that he had read Dr. Chen's published papers on temporal mechanics and wanted to discuss her research in more detail, particularly her theoretical work on consciousness transfer across temporal boundaries. Dr. Chen agreed to meet with Dr. Webb, initially assuming he was a fellow academic interested in collaborating on theoretical research. But within minutes of beginning their conversation, she realized that something was profoundly wrong. Dr. Webb's questions were too specific, too precisely targeted at the exact aspects of her unpublished work that related to actual temporal research rather than pure theory. He asked about her investigation of historical anomalies, her analysis of the World War II memorandum, and most alarmingly, her knowledge of the Everett photograph, despite the fact that she had never publicly mentioned James Everett or the Civil War image she had been studying. When Dr. Chen challenged him directly, asking how he knew about her confidential research, Dr. Webb paused for a long moment before responding. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, "I think you've already guessed the truth. I'm not from your time period. I'm a temporal research coordinator from the year 2093, and I'm here because your investigation has created a situation that threatens to destabilize the timeline." Dr. Chen felt her heart racing as she processed this admission. She had spent years searching for evidence of temporal researchers in the 20th century, and now one was sitting in her laboratory openly acknowledging his origins. Her first instinct was skepticism. Anyone familiar with her published work could claim to be a time traveler. But Dr. Webb anticipated her doubts. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a device that looked superficially like a calculator, but incorporated design elements and materials that Dr. Chen immediately recognized as beyond current technology. The device's screen displayed information in a format she had never seen, using symbols and notation that seemed to represent mathematical concepts she could barely comprehend. "I'm showing you this against protocol," Dr. Webb said, "because we need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. Your investigation into temporal research, while academically impressive, has brought you close to discoveries that could fundamentally alter the development of time travel technology. If you continue on your current path and publish your findings, you will inspire research directions that lead to unstable temporal displacement methods in the early 21st century. Those unstable methods will cause several tragic accidents before the proper safety protocols are developed, accidents that kill dozens of researchers and nearly derail temporal research entirely." Dr. Chen struggled to process this information. Dr. Webb was claiming that her theoretical work, if published, would influence the actual development of time travel in ways that would cause preventable deaths. But the claim also revealed something crucial about how temporal research operated. Researchers from the future were monitoring the past not just to observe and document, but to prevent certain discoveries or actions that would lead to undesirable outcomes. This suggested a level of active intervention in the timeline that contradicted the strict non-interference protocols described in the World War II memorandum. Dr. Webb seemed to read her confusion. "I know this contradicts what you learned from the wartime documents," he said. "The truth is that temporal research protocols have evolved significantly between the 2050s and my own time. Early temporal research operated under strict non-interference rules, but we eventually realized that complete non-interference was impossible. The mere presence of temporal researchers in the past influences events in subtle ways, creating micro-changes in the timeline that accumulate over iterations. We now operate under what we call managed timeline stewardship, which allows limited interventions to prevent catastrophic outcomes while maintaining the general trajectory of historical development." This revelation fundamentally changed Dr. Chen's understanding of temporal research. The temporal researchers she had been studying were not passive observers, but active managers of the timeline, making strategic interventions to guide history toward outcomes they considered desirable. This raised profound ethical questions about free will and historical determinism. If people from the future were subtly manipulating the past to achieve specific outcomes, then was human history truly the product of human choices? Or was it being orchestrated by future temporal research organizations pursuing agendas that past populations could neither see nor challenge? Dr. Webb spent the next 3 hours explaining the realities of temporal research in greater detail than any captured researcher had revealed during World War II. He described how time travel had first been achieved in 2021 by a team of physicists working at CERN, using a technique that involved creating microscopic wormholes through space-time using exotic matter created in particle accelerators. The initial breakthrough had allowed only the transmission of information backward in time, but by 2026, researchers had developed methods for transferring human consciousness into the past, reconstructing physical bodies using quantum entanglement principles that Dr. Chen could barely grasp even with Dr. Webb's detailed explanations. The establishment of formal temporal research programs had begun in 2028, with the creation of the United States Historical Documentation Service's Temporal Research Division, the same organization that had sent James Everett to document the Chattanooga Campaign in 1863. Over the following decades, similar organizations had been established by governments around the world, eventually leading to international agreements governing temporal research activities and establishing protocols for preventing timeline contamination and managing paradoxes. Dr. Webb explained that temporal researchers operated under strict guidelines that balanced the need for historical documentation against the risks of altering the timeline. Researchers were carefully selected and extensively trained in the history and culture of their target periods, provided with authentic documentation and period-appropriate equipment, and given cover identities that allowed them to integrate seamlessly into historical populations. They were forbidden from preventing major historical events or significantly altering the lives of historically important individuals, but they were allowed to make minor interventions that improved welfare outcomes or prevented unnecessary suffering, without changing the overall trajectory of history. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Webb described the iteration problem that temporal researchers had discovered through decades of trial and error. Every time someone traveled into the past and interacted with that time period, they created subtle changes in the timeline that propagated forward, resulting in a slightly different version of the future. Temporal researchers returning to their origin points often found that small details had changed. Different people occupied certain positions, minor historical events had occurred differently, cultural trends had shifted in subtle ways. These changes were generally minor enough that society remained recognizable, but they accumulated over multiple temporal research missions, creating increasingly divergent timeline iterations. To manage this problem, Temporal research organizations had established what Dr. Webb called anchor points, specific historical events and individuals whose outcomes were carefully monitored and maintained across timeline iterations. The photograph of James Everett was one such anchor point. Dr. Pierce's investigation and the eventual discovery of the message on the tintype's backing were crucial events that needed to occur in a specific way to ensure that temporal research developed along the correct path. If Dr. Chen published her findings prematurely, or revealed information that was supposed to remain confidential until specific future dates, she would disrupt the carefully managed sequence of discoveries that led to stable temporal displacement technology. Dr. Webb's visit left Dr. Chen profoundly unsettled. She now knew with certainty that time travel would be achieved and that her own theoretical work would contribute to its development, but she also understood that she was being monitored and manipulated by organizations from the future who believed they had the right to guide her research in specific directions. The photograph of James Everett, which had seemed like evidence of humanity's future achievements, now appeared as a tool for managing her behavior, a carefully placed artifact designed to inspire certain research directions while preventing others. In the weeks following Dr. Webb's visit, Dr. Chen struggled with profound questions about free will, ethics, and her responsibilities to both her own time and the future that temporal researchers represented. Dr. Webb had asked her to cease her investigation into temporal research and to delay publication of her theoretical work until 2003, when he claimed the timeline would be stable enough to absorb her discoveries without causing destabilizing effects. He had promised that if she cooperated, she would be remembered by future historians as a crucial contributor to temporal displacement theory. Her work cited in the foundational papers that eventually led to the CERN breakthrough in 2021, but cooperation meant abandoning her search for other temporal researchers, ceasing her documentation of historical anomalies, and essentially allowing herself to be guided by an organization she had never chosen to serve, and whose goals she could not fully evaluate. Dr. Webb had presented temporal research as a benevolent force working to improve historical outcomes, but Dr. Chen recognized that this was only one perspective. The temporal researchers she had studied operated from the assumption that they knew better than past populations what outcomes were desirable, that they had the right to subtly manipulate history to achieve goals that people living through those historical moments could not consent to or oppose. Margaret Whitmore, when Dr. Chen shared the details of Webb's visit, had a different reaction. At 88 years old, Margaret had spent much of her life as the guardian of the photograph of James Everett, maintaining its secrets while watching the world change around her. She had witnessed World War II, the atomic age, the Cold War, the space race, and countless other transformations that had reshaped human civilization. To learn that all of these events had potentially been influenced by temporal researchers operating from the future filled her with a deep sense of violation, as if her entire life had been a performance orchestrated by observers she had never been able to see or challenge. "They're treating us like laboratory subjects," Margaret said bitterly during one of their conversations. "Every choice we make, every discovery we achieve, it's all being monitored and managed by people who believe they have the right to interfere when we don't follow the script they've written for us." Dr. Webb spoke about preventing tragic accidents, but who gave them the authority to decide which accidents are preventable and which futures are desirable? We're not children who need to be protected from our own mistakes. We're human beings entitled to make our own choices and live with their consequences. Dr. Chen understood Margaret's anger, but she also recognized the complexity of the situation. If temporal research would be developed regardless of her choices, then refusing to cooperate with Dr. Webb might simply result in a different temporal researcher being sent to manage her work, possibly using less transparent methods. And if her published research would genuinely lead to fatal accidents in the early development of time travel, did she have a moral obligation to delay publication even if it meant accepting guidance from the future? The question of whether preventing future deaths justified limiting present freedom had no clear answer. In April 1975, Dr. Chen made a decision that would determine the course of temporal research for generations. She would not cease her investigation or delay her publications as Dr. Webb had requested, but neither would she actively work to disrupt the timeline by revealing information prematurely or attempting to alter the development path of temporal displacement technology. Instead, she would continue her research openly, publishing her theoretical findings as she completed them, while maintaining careful documentation of everything she learned about temporal research for future scholars who might seek to understand how time travel actually developed. This approach, which Dr. Chen called transparent resistance, was designed to challenge the assumption that temporal researchers had unlimited authority to manage the timeline while avoiding actions that might cause genuine harm. By publishing her work openly, she would force temporal research organizations to either accept her contributions as part of the natural development of temporal theory, or reveal their presence more explicitly by attempting to suppress her publications. Either outcome would provide valuable information about how temporal research actually operated and what limitations governed their interventions. Dr. Chen's first major publication under this new approach appeared in Physical Review Letters in September 1975. The paper, titled Quantum Consciousness Transfer as a Theoretical Framework for Temporal Displacement, laid out the mathematical foundations for how human consciousness might be projected backward through time, using quantum entanglement principles. The paper was highly theoretical and made no explicit reference to actual time travel or temporal research, but anyone familiar with the field would recognize it as a crucial step toward practical temporal displacement technology. The paper generated significant interest in the physics community and attracted funding that allowed Dr. Chen to establish a research group dedicated to studying temporal mechanics. Over the next decade, she published a series of papers that systematically developed the theoretical framework necessary for time travel, each building on the previous work, to create an increasingly complete picture of how temporal displacement might be achieved. Her work attracted talented graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who contributed their own insights, creating a collaborative research program that advanced temporal theory far more rapidly than Dr. Webb had suggested was desirable. Dr. Webb visited Dr. Chen twice more during this period, in 1980 and 1987, each time expressing concern about the pace of her research and the attention it was attracting from military and intelligence agencies interested in potential temporal applications. He warned that her refusal to follow the managed timeline could result in temporal research developing along unstable paths that would cause precisely the accidents he had described during their first meeting. But Dr. Chen remained committed to her course, arguing that humanity deserved to develop time travel through its own efforts, rather than having the technology's development orchestrated by organizations from the future pursuing unknown agendas. The tension between Dr. Chen's approach and the temporal research establishment's preferred timeline came to a head in 1991 when she published a paper describing specific experimental protocols for creating microscopic wormholes using particle accelerators. The paper provided enough detail that a sufficiently funded research team could potentially attempt practical temporal displacement experiments decades earlier than the official history suggested time travel had been developed. Within weeks of the paper's publication, Dr. Chen began noticing signs that she was being monitored more intensively, strangers appearing repeatedly in locations she frequented, unusual technical problems with her research equipment, and subtle pressure from university administrators to redirect her research toward less controversial topics. In October 1991, Dr. Chen received a visit from someone who identified herself as Director Patricia Summers from what she called the Temporal Integrity Commission, an international organization from the year 2147 that oversaw temporal research activities across multiple timeline iterations. Director Summers was far less diplomatic than Dr. Webb had been, bluntly informing Dr. Chen that her continued research was creating unacceptable risks to timeline stability, and that the Commission had authorized corrective interventions to manage the situation. Dr. Chen asked what form these corrective interventions would take, and Director Summers explained with disturbing frankness that the Commission had several options available. They could arrange for Dr. Chen's research funding to be terminated, effectively ending her ability to continue practical experiments. They could introduce subtle errors into her published work that would lead subsequent researchers down unproductive paths, delaying practical time travel development by decades. Or as a last resort, they could arrange for Dr. Chen herself to be temporally displaced, removed from her current timeline, and relocated to an alternative iteration where her knowledge could not influence temporal research development. The threat was clear: continue on her current path and face consequences that could include her complete removal from reality as she understood it. Dr. Chen realized that she had significantly underestimated the extent to which temporal research organizations from the future were willing to intervene to maintain their preferred timeline. Director Summers' visit forced Dr. Chen to confront the limits of her transparent resistance strategy. She had assumed that temporal research organizations, despite their willingness to make subtle interventions, would ultimately respect the autonomy of past populations and allow history to develop through natural human agency. But Director Summers had made clear that timeline management was not a collaborative process. It was enforcement of a predetermined sequence that temporal authorities believed necessary for achieving stable temporal displacement technology without catastrophic accidents or timeline paradoxes. Yet even as Dr. Chen grappled with this disturbing reality, she recognized an opportunity. Director Summers' explicit threats revealed something crucial about how temporal research actually operated. The Commission's willingness to threaten direct intervention suggested that Dr. Chen's research was genuinely affecting the timeline in ways that concerned future organizations, which meant that the timeline was not as rigidly fixed as temporal researchers often implied. If the future could be changed by present actions, then temporal research organizations did not simply observe or manage a predetermined sequence. They actively fought to maintain specific outcomes against the natural variability of human choices and discoveries. This insight led Dr. Chen to develop a new strategy. Rather than continuing to publish research that directly threatened the managed timeline, she would shift her focus to documenting the evidence of temporal research itself, creating a comprehensive historical record that would eventually reveal to future populations how extensively their history had been manipulated by temporal research organizations. She began assembling all the materials she and Margaret had collected over 2 decades: the photograph of James Everett, copies of the World War II memorandum, documentation of historical anomalies, and detailed notes about her interactions with Dr. Webb and Director Summers. In 1992, Dr. Chen established what she called the Temporal Research Documentation Project, a seemingly academic initiative focused on studying historical anomalies and unexplained technological artifacts. The project's stated goal was to catalog instances where historical evidence suggested knowledge or capabilities that seemed inconsistent with the accepted understanding of technological development in specific time periods. To outside observers, it appeared to be an eccentric but harmless academic project exploring historical mysteries and curiosities. But the project's true purpose was far more significant. Dr. Chen was creating a comprehensive archive that would allow future historians to reconstruct how temporal research had actually developed, including documentation of the interventions and manipulations that temporal research organizations had attempted to keep secret. She recognized that she could not prevent time travel from being achieved or force temporal research organizations to abandon their timeline management activities. But she could ensure that when time travel was finally achieved, the people who developed and used that technology would have access to a complete historical record showing how their predecessors had been manipulated and controlled by organizations from their own future. The archive grew steadily throughout the 1990s as Dr. Chen and Margaret Whitmore worked to document every case of potential temporal research they could identify. They reached out to historians, archivists, and collectors around the world, seeking information about historical anomalies and unexplained artifacts. They interviewed elderly individuals who remembered unusual encounters or witnessed events that seemed inconsistent with the accepted historical narrative. They compiled databases of photographs, documents, and physical objects that showed signs of anachronistic origins or impossible knowledge. By 1998, the Temporal Research Documentation Project's archive contained more than 15,000 individual case files, spanning from ancient history through the present day. Most cases were ambiguous, potentially explainable through conventional means, but approximately 200 cases showed strong evidence of temporal research activity, artifacts incorporating materials or technologies unavailable in their supposed time period, written accounts describing people with impossible knowledge of future events. photographs showing subjects whose appearance or behavior seemed inconsistent with their era. The archive's most significant finding was the identification of patterns in temporal research activity across different historical periods. Dr. Chen discovered that temporal research missions appeared to concentrate around specific historical events: major wars, scientific breakthroughs, political transitions, and cultural transformations. This suggested that temporal research organizations prioritized documenting moments when human civilization underwent significant changes, presumably because these moments had the greatest influence on long-term historical trajectories. More disturbingly, Dr. Chen identified several cases where temporal researchers appeared to have made active interventions that altered historical outcomes. A mysterious engineer who had appeared in the Wright brothers' workshop shortly before their successful flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903 and suggested critical modifications to their aircraft design. A doctor working at a London hospital during the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 who had used treatment protocols decades ahead of their time, saving hundreds of lives. A civilian advisor to the Manhattan Project who had provided crucial insights that accelerated the development of atomic weapons by months, potentially changing the outcome of World War II. These cases suggested that temporal research organizations were not merely documenting history, but actively shaping it, making strategic interventions designed to guide civilization along specific developmental paths. The implications were profound and troubling. If major historical events and scientific breakthroughs had been influenced or even orchestrated by temporal researchers, then human history as understood by contemporary populations was partially fiction, a carefully managed narrative that concealed the extent to which the future had reached backward to guide the past. Margaret Whitmore passed away in December 2000 at the age of 93, having devoted the final 3 decades of her life to documenting evidence of temporal research. On her deathbed, she made Dr. Chen promise to continue the archive and ensure that it would eventually be made available to future populations. Dr. Chen honored that promise, establishing a trust that would maintain the archive and release its contents according to a carefully designed schedule that would maximize its impact on the development of temporal research ethics and protocols. The photograph of James Everett, which had started the entire investigation 56 years earlier, was placed at the center of the archive as its most significant artifact. Dr. Chen prepared extensive documentation describing its discovery, Dr. Pierce's analysis, the message etched on its backing, and all the subsequent investigation that had revealed the scope and nature of temporal research activities. She included detailed arguments about why future temporal researchers should operate transparently rather than manipulating past populations without their knowledge or consent, drawing on decades of ethical analysis and moral philosophy to make the case for what she called consensual temporal research. Dr. Sarah Chen died in 2008 at the age of 72, having spent 40 years investigating and documenting temporal research activities. Her obituaries in scientific journals described her as a pioneering theoretical physicist whose work on quantum consciousness had laid important groundwork for understanding the relationship between mind and matter, but made no mention of her decades-long investigation into time travel. The Temporal Research Documentation Project Archive, containing 15,000 case files and hundreds of thousands of pages of analysis and documentation, was sealed in climate-controlled storage with instructions that it should be gradually released to the public between 2020 and 2040, timed to coincide with the period when temporal displacement technology would actually be developed. In 2021, when physicists at CERN achieved the first successful transmission of quantum information backward through time, researchers studying the breakthrough discovered Dr. Chen's archived papers detailing the theoretical framework that had made their achievement possible. As they continued developing practical temporal displacement methods over the following years, more of the archive became accessible, revealing the full history of how temporal research organizations from various future iterations had attempted to manage the technology's development and the ethical questions that their interventions had raised. The photograph of James Everett, taken in 1863 and discovered in 1944, finally achieved its true purpose in 2028 when the United States Historical Documentation Service's Temporal Research Division was officially established. The division's founding charter explicitly referenced Dr. Chen's archive and the ethical arguments she had developed, establishing protocols designed to balance the value of historical documentation against the rights of past populations to live their lives free from manipulation by future observers. Lieutenant James Everett, when he was finally sent back to 1863 and 2029 as part of the division's inaugural research mission, carried with him a copy of Dr. Chen's complete archive and instructions to ensure that the photograph and its hidden message would be placed where they would eventually be found by Margaret Whitmore in 1944. He understood that his mission was not merely to document the Chattanooga campaign, but to participate in a complex temporal loop that had been carefully designed to ensure that temporal research developed along an ethical path that honored human agency while achieving the scientific breakthroughs that made time travel possible. As he posed for the photograph that would puzzle researchers for decades, James Everett smiled genuinely, amused by the intricate web of cause and effect that had brought him to this moment. He knew that the photograph would survive for over a century and 60 years, that it would inspire investigations that would shape how future civilizations approached the manipulation of time itself, and that his brief presence in 1863 would echo across generations in ways that most people living through their own historical moments could never imagine. The photograph remains in the archive today, preserved as Artifact 001 in the International Temporal Research Registry, a reminder that time is not the simple linear progression it appears to be, that past and future are intimately connected through webs of cause and effect that span centuries, and that the choices made by individuals in any time period can resonate across the entire timeline, shaping not just their own future, but the futures of civilizations yet to exist. And somewhere in that photograph, frozen in 19th century tintype silver, a Civil War soldier continues to smile with knowledge that transcends his era. An impossible figure who exists simultaneously in the past, being observed, and the future doing the observing. Forever suspended at the intersection where human history and human destiny become indistinguishable from one another.